Hello everybody, and thank you for tuning into Zeal or No Zeal, the YouTube series that discusses whether games excite. Today, up on the chopping block is Hive Jump, published by Graphite Lab. Hive Jump is an action platforming title that incorporates some turn-based strategy elements. I was initially excited about the trailer and remembered having a bit of fun with the game when I first picked it up. Did it live up to what I thought it would? Find out in this episode of Zeal or No Zeal. The first thing I want to discuss is the world building. The story in Hive Jump is nothing special. The text is relatively boring, but the premise is understandable, and it sets up the gameplay proficiently. I did, however, appreciate how the story justified the difficulty curve. Since the story is about a war, the different campaigns represent battles with different circumstances. The first campaign had me defending a city, whereas I needed to attack an enemy city in later segments. It justified the increases in difficulty I encountered, which was cute, and I appreciated that. In no way do I think the story is a draw to the game, but the story had some interesting elements that enhanced it. While the world building is sufficient for an action platformer, the worlds themselves are lacking. The primary gameplay loop had me fighting through procedurally generated caves filled with alien bugs. The concept is fun, and I enjoyed taking out the enemies and finding my way through these unmarked areas. However, there were only about 5 distinct themes, and even within the themes, nothing really changed. While usually themes have very little impact on my experience, Hive Jump had me replaying practically the same levels and the same mechanics over and over again. It was frustrating, especially because when I lost, not only did I lose that area, but I'd have to repeat up to 30 minutes of the same content I just attempted. Since I was constantly revisiting the same areas, both when I died and when I succeeded, the levels got stale. This was disappointing, as I was interested in progressing through new concepts and ideas. Instead, I visited the same locations and the same enemies. I felt practically the same way about the enemy designs too. Initially, I was excited to see the different enemies. While they were all bugs, some were melee attackers and others shot projectiles. The bugs were varied. I even enjoyed how some of the creatures synergized with the traps in the world. For example, one of the bugs launched me into the air as it dealt damage. This was especially scary because the hives in Hive Jump are riddled with dangerous and instantly lethal traps. The enemy designs themselves enhanced my experience, and also collaborated with the world around me to keep me engaged, at least for a time. Unfortunately, like the level themes, the enemy designs also stagnated. This time, it was even more prevalent. Each of the themes features practically the same enemies. Some are suicide bombers, some fling the character into the air, and others shoot projectiles. While they are varied in their design, there are only so many designs. I quickly found myself getting bored and craving variety that Hive Jump just did not have. Moreover, this concept was even prevalent in the boss designs. To complete each level or challenge in the campaign, I needed to make it through layers in a hive. I also had to fight bosses every 3 levels. As I mentioned previously, this is time-consuming and monotonous. However, this is further enhanced because there are only 6 distinct bosses. This meant I was constantly finding myself taking on the same bosses, even in the same section of the campaign. In fact, I likely faced off against each boss tens of times. This was boring, as at that point I knew their patterns so easily that they ended up being easier than the regular stages. To be entirely honest, I liked the boss designs, and I even found them threatening the first couple of times I faced them. However, they quickly lost their luster, and I found myself bored taking them on in the end. In fact, the same principle applies to almost everything the game has to offer. The game quickly stagnates. Instead of feeling rewarded for taking out hordes of enemies, I felt bored trying to fight through the same levels and areas repeatedly. I found myself disconnecting from the game and not paying attention to it as much while playing. Initially, I liked this, as the less intensive difficulty curve kept me from focusing too hard. However, it frustrated me as the game got more difficult. I felt like I was wasting my time trying to get through the game because there were not enough interesting mechanics or designs to keep me coming back. This is especially disappointing because Hive Jump features strategy elements. Much like a real war, there were different battlefields with various quantities of troops. I prepared different battlefields by collecting in-game currency on each of my dives into a hive. The concept was interesting, and it added some semblance of a resource management aspect to the game. However, The actual implication was far less effective than I would have liked. I almost had a near endless amount of the in-game currency, so adding troops to my station was never a big deal. The resource management didn't add to my experience, and I never felt there was much strategy behind succeeding in these segments. I always took extra caution and spent plenty of the in-game currency to ensure my survival, yet I still had plenty to spare. The currency and even the strategy mechanics fell flat and left me incredibly disappointed. Moreover, in the event that I did lose one of these areas, I needed to restart almost the entire chapter. This could be around 100 layers of the hive just going away. The system wasn't overly challenging, especially since I had so much currency. However, I wouldn't want it to be challenging. Then I would have to replay the same levels one more time. I know it sounds harsh, but the strategy rarely added to the game. In fact, it mildly took away from it because occasionally I had to replay levels that I didn't want to. While I've mentioned a lot of negative things about Hive Jump, the character did feel good to control. I had a jetpack and plenty of customizable options for my rifle. I even had some unlockable special moves. The weaponry, while not overly varied, did help differentiate my experience, especially as I was learning the new mechanics. Even special moves were fun. I liked having the overshield, but there were also other options like a teleporter or a turret. The main character was fun to mess around with, and it was this saving grace that kept this game from being shelved for good. Hive Jump even includes a very innovative death mechanic. The soldiers I play as are practically pawns in the operation. The most important part of my main character is a backpack that they come into the world with. Whenever I kill a soldier, the backpack will attempt to communicate with the outside world and beam in a new one. Until that happens, I would play as the backpack and try to avoid attacks without being able to damage my enemies. It was a clever mechanic, especially because there were a lot of cheap and unfair deaths. I always had to manage the health of my backpack. However, while it was fun, it didn't really make me enjoy the game more. Instead, to counteract this seemingly insurmountable wave of my soldiers' lives, the developers made a bunch of one-hit kills and devastating traps. One enemy devours my character whole, and is entirely invincible. Overall, the scenarios weren't that devastating, especially considering how many times I could respawn, but these moments took me out of my flow state, and just made me more frustrated with the game. It added up over time, and after a while, it wasn't fun anymore. The levels are not difficult, they're just tedious. And look, Hive Jump has a lot of excellent attributes. To be honest, the game's not bad, and that's the saddest part. The game just feels padded out for length. I like the mechanics fine, and the enemies are functional, even though they do get stale. I had fun when I fought everything for the first time. However, even if I only did consider my experience on the first time playing each level, none of them urged me to spread the word of the game. Hive Jump's lacking a lot of variety, especially for the price point, even though it has a good core. And simply, the game just does not feature enough unique content to keep me interested or to make the game stand out. Thus, we've decided that Hive Jump does not have zeal. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed.